Hello everybody, hope you're all surviving. Sorry I've been away for a while, I got caught in a real busy time. The series on Sparta will be back after this video, don't worry. I just wanted to take an interlude to talk about something in the news that's currently ongoing. And this is the European Union's lawsuit against the UK on the basis that the UK government has introduced the Internal Market Bill that overrides the withdrawal agreement and therefore breaks the international law that international agreements should be upheld. And this story gave me the inspiration to make this video because I want to be able to show you the difference between the layer of political or media waffle and the deeper real conflicts that certainly interest me and that are going on underneath. And this is a very good and easy example to demonstrate this. I know personally I used to worry a lot about not being able to keep up with the news, and if you find yourself in that situation or not being able to discern which news story is about fact and which are about the media class's opinions, then hopefully this video can give you some insight into how I have tried to surmount the avalanche of information via history. This video is going to be a little different from my other ones therefore, in so much as what I really want to achieve is giving you a real example of how I, or indeed a historian, might interpret or simply wade through news stories. I'll be presenting this as an argument, but largely because I think that these things are better to demonstrate and they're more accessible for you when they're done as a real example. What you'll get is an actual thought process about an actual event with an actual conclusion that applies to the real world. I could have sat here and given you the kind of abstract, on the one hand this and on the other hand that kind of discussion between myself and some artificial interlocutor where we come to a non-conclusion with no relevance or use for the real world. And look, that has its place, don't get me wrong, but this channel is called Real History. It's to show you how history is or can be applied to today. And frankly, it's more fun, it's more useful, it's more interesting, and it's more honest to sometimes just give an argument for something. It gives you something tangible and applied to sink your teeth into. I'm not a lawyer, this isn't a legal analysis of this case. I'm simply trying to place or show you how you can place specific events within their overall historical contexts. I've had to split this video up into 3 parts to make it more manageable because the script was running at about 12,000 words, and I'll release them in sequence, but they're really one long video. Anyway, let's first start by assessing what I'm calling the layer of waffle. The legislation the UK government is proposing is entirely unremarkable so far as legislation goes. The UK has introduced a piece of domestic legislation about domestic economics and in part designed to protect the integrity of the UK state. And it has done this because the good faith negotiations with the EU are clearly stalled and time is running out, and thus the situation has changed from when the withdrawal agreement was signed and where compromise was promised. And thus this legislation has been introduced at this time as insurance to protect the UK, a nation-state democracy, whose integrity is itself protected by international law. At least that's what I'd say if I were the UK government, not least because it's true. However, the smoking gun that I'm going to address from the very outset is that the UK government has stated explicitly that it intends to break international law. This has prompted the EU and its supporters to accuse the UK government of not obeying the principle of the rule of law and of becoming a rogue state, like North Korea. Because, you know, only fascists like Boris break international law. Note that the UK government has admitted that it will break international law, but not that it isn't obeying the rule of law. By the end of this video, I hope you'll see why. It might seem like a distinction that is frivolous, but my point is that it is anything but. Of course, the principle aside, if you can't see the difference between breaking international law to prevent one part of sovereign territory being pried away with an eye towards annexation, and breaking it to invade Crimea, or stockpile nuclear weapons with intent to use, or committing genocide, then this video probably isn't for you. Or maybe actually it is for you more than anybody else. But as an aside, considering that governments break international law in this way all of the time, as we'll shortly see, it is beyond me why this government has decided that now is the time to grow a conscience, stop playing political games, and hand the European Union the keys to its own lawsuit. Maybe with all the stress they have, they just wanted to get their skeletons out and relieve the guilt. And actually, that might not be as silly as you might think. It may well be that a kind of guilty conscience is at work here, and I have a suspicion about quite a few of the dodgy and seemingly inept decisions that the Boris government has made, that seem to contrast with its massive victories, like getting a general election in 2019 and then winning a huge majority in it, or indeed winning the Brexit referendum in the first place. And this suspicion is that Brexit or no Brexit, Conservative or Labour, Brexiteer or no Brexiteer, the entire political class, and indeed the class in charge of all institutions, has all been brought up in the culture, the values, the thought processes, and the instincts of left liberalism. And left liberalism is an ideology completely at odds with Brexit, with the nation state, and with democracy. And it is basically the same view of the world that the EU has, give or take a few different specific factional differences. And so, even if they don't want to, even if they actually support Brexit, British politicians will find themselves inadvertently coming to all of the same conclusions as the EU, simply because they think in the same way, from the same value judgments, and by instinct. So they find themselves battling against their own nature to carry out Brexit. And hence, in this context, admitting that they are being naughty is exactly what you'd expect from people who believe that what they are doing is naughty, and believe it so deeply that they find themselves compelled to relieve themselves of the burden. My point being that this is more of an ideological admittance and not an admittance of fact. So that's the smoking gun looked at. Next, given that the EU is resting its arguments on an assertion of the principle of the rule of law, let's look at how rigorous the EU and its broad base of supporters and like-minded thinkers are in upholding their own principles. Take Amal Clooney, favourite celebrity lawyer. She was appointed a UK Special Envoy for Media Freedom, but because of the UK government's internal market bill, she has resigned on the basis that this is beyond the pale. Fair enough, if only we were also rich and fabulous to take moral stands when we please. I'm only curious why she didn't mind taking and completing a job with the King of Bahrain, who is known to oppress, convict, execute, and allegedly torture his own people, especially when they're his critics. Well, let's look at the EU itself. It's well known that EU member states are constantly picking and choosing which EU legislation they follow, and when, and thus that there is daily breaking of international law. And recently, Germany, the most important EU state, broke international law for, at heart, exactly the same reason the UK has done. Germany rejected the European Central Bank's public sector purchase programme on the basis that they don't like the extent of its scope, and thus, German law can supersede it. Wow, if only the UK had thought of that. As of writing, the EU is not taking action against Germany, and they definitely haven't called Germany a rogue state. And I noticed that the leftover Ramonas haven't demanded that we invade Germany to liberate its people from this tyranny. The reason for this discrepancy in EU action is, I think, quite simple, and has been consistent throughout Brexit. Brexit is a process that the EU wants to be as destructive to the UK as possible, and, in its own words, to turn the UK into a colony. And this is because, no matter what the left liberals say about who is more powerful, Brexit is a fight for survival for the EU in a way that it isn't for the UK. Let me put it to you like this. If Brexit turns out to be bad, then the UK has made a mistake and it plods on a little worse off. End of. But if Brexit turns out to be good, then it at least gives the impression that the EU was bad for Britain, perhaps thus bad for member states, and perhaps therefore a redundant body, or worse, actively deleterious to said member states. Okay, so that's the EU's position fleshed out quickly. Next, let's inquire into this idea that the UK has made itself a rogue state, obliterating its entire international reputation. One of the reasons why this was a perfect example for use in this video was because it demonstrated how completely abstract from reality the arguments of the EU and its supporters, and left liberalism in general, really are. Because on the same day that this story broke, there was one other main story. So, story one was that the UK is a rogue state with an obliterated international reputation, and story two was that the UK had agreed its first major trade deal with Japan, the world's third largest economy, and clearly a major international player. I mean, right there is the perfect dichotomy between fantasy and reality, between the waffle and the reality. You couldn't make it up. I mean, personally, I know it's sad, but I live for little moments like this. These sorts of things really, they bring you back down to earth. They're funny and humbling at the same time. I want to be clear that, as suggested by the title of this video, how the UK broke international law and obeyed the rule of law at the same time, that there is a sensible and practical argument that can be made against the UK as regards the principle of international law. And this argument goes that if the UK decided to break international law, even in a minor way, even for good reasons, then the principle of international law has been broken. And that means that there is no principle to prevent Russia from invading Crimea, North Korea stockpiling nuclear weapons with intent, and China committing genocide. You don't need a degree in international relations or PPE to make this point, and it's sad, because the other side couldn't even make this reasonable point. Nonetheless, let me reply to it. Firstly, this is the problem of law, in this case international law, that is contradictory and confused. What is the point of international law that on the one hand prevents one nation state from invading another, but on the other actively facilitates the annexation of a part of a nation state by a supranational body like the EU? As it happens, I think that the underlying philosophy and values of international law are anti-nation state and pro-supranational or post-national states, but we'll park that just for the moment. Secondly, this argument does ignore the reality of the situation, and it prioritises the letter of the law over the spirit. As we've seen, states breach treaties all of the time, and the idea that the UK has become the same as North Korea, or that ensuring control of domestic economics is the same as invading Crimea, is idiotic. Especially since you may have noticed I picked 3 examples that have happened regardless of the UK's moral position. In fact, only when the UK is led by fanatical Europhiles does the EU act like a rogue state, funnily enough. And thirdly, that this argument prioritises the letter of the law arbitrarily, so that it can avoid the real fundamental conflicts going on, which would force the various political forces out into the open, just as Brexit did when it led to the zombie parliament's attempted coup. So we've had a glimpse at how these things are not as clear-cut as they might seem, and let's begin going a little deeper. And since I'm willing to move forward on the premise that the UK has broken international law, let's look instead at this phrase, the rule of law. What does it mean? What law or system of law is it referring to? After all, there are many systems of law, and they all have different value systems. By value systems, I simply mean the different things they value and how they come to their conclusions about them. That leads nicely into another question. What is law for? I'm going to take it as granted that, at least in principle, all of us would agree that obeying a law is only good if the law itself is good, or at least not bad, or at the very least part of a broader package of laws that work out okay. For example, if tomorrow the legislators of your society passed a law requiring you to kill all the white people you saw, or to punch a woman every time you saw her, I trust that none of you would follow this law simply on the principle that we have to obey the rule of law. My point is that there are different historical and philosophical reasons that systems of law justify and therefore legitimise themselves by. This observation is very far from novel, which makes it even more embarrassing that it's the position of the EU and its supporters. We see its hallmarks in the Socratic dialogue, we see it in Euthyphro's dilemma, for example. Western society, therefore, should have long ago moved beyond the simple question of do we obey the law or not, full stop, to the position of when should we obey the law, which law, and why. And I can't help but notice that Socrates and Jesus, arguably the 2 most important and foundational figures of Western civilization, they both die in the same way. In the context of the stories, they are executed because they break bad laws, on the charge that they are challenging the fundamental premises of each contemporary society, and they're executed by the very same people that they are trying to save. So clearly we've been having these types of arguments for a long time. Now I think that all systems of law claim to point towards some good, and often that good becomes synonymous with stability, hence the phrase law and order. But much like the rule of law, or good, or stability, the definition of law and order can vary wildly, such as meaning the will of the ruler, to the sense of justice within society, to whatever God says is right. And amazingly in this case, we actually know what God thinks about this whole argument, courtesy of some archbishops from the Church of England. Now, you're going to love these guys. They're kind of churchmen Voltaire would have eaten for breakfast. I mean, they've written an open letter, and they're outraged by the Internal Market Bill, and it's just so bad it's good, and it's a great example in and of itself of how not to argue for the rule of law. So, firstly, the letter is published in the Financial Times. Now, again, a bit like the dual headline, showing the distinction between the Europhiles' propaganda and reality, This just makes me chuckle. I mean, nothing says principled Christianity like the Financial Times, money, money, money. Can you see why I had to have an interlude from Sparta to make these videos? There's too many golden nuggets to sink your teeth into. I wonder what the Financial Times makes of Christ's advice that the rich man shall not pass into heaven as the camel can't through the eye of the needle. I mean, how fitting. I also note that the Financial Times has been dogmatically pro-EU throughout Brexit. Anyway, secondly, the bishops condemn the bill because they say it would create a disastrous precedent. Well, that's what you might think if you're the kind of priest that Jesus tossed out of the temple, spending your time at the FT or reading the New European. But if they'd read their history, they'd know that actually there is plenty of precedent for it. For one, we have innumerable examples of other EU states doing it. Domestically, I think there was this chap called Henry, and he defied international law as well when he broke with Rome. And he also engaged in domestic economics by nationalising the monasteries. And I also note that this led to the greatest era of British prosperity and, albeit by empire, spread things like capitalism and democracy and the rule of law around the world. A little closer to home, I've also been informed that in 1964 a British judge ruled in favour of the government when it breached the Geneva Convention on the Sea, and the judge stated that the Crown has a sovereign right, which the court cannot question, to change its policy. That's precedent too. Well, the archbishops, undeterred, would brush this all aside. They go on to say that if laws can be legally broken, on what foundation does our democracy stand? Well, that's a curious statement, because the democracy of the UK stands upon the precedent of history, and we've just seen that it's on the side of the Internal Market Bill. And that if we compared the Internal Market Bill to the EU's own legislation, we would find it much more democratic. And good luck working out which of you has ever voted for international law. No, the Internal Market Bill is democracy in action, and it all rather gives the impression that the archbishops don't have a problem with the rule of law, but they have a problem with democracy. They don't like a system of law that is based upon democratically elected legislators, with the legislation proposed by a democratically elected government, carrying out a democratically elected referendum result, and acting to ensure the integrity of a democratic nation state. And finally, they're so dim that they haven't noticed that laws are legally broken every single day. Wasn't it only yesterday that Ramonas were demanding a second referendum and a repeal of the withdrawal bill on the basis that democracy is a process and not a movement? Another golden nugget to chew on there. Anyway, the nature of almost all legislation today is that it breaks existing legislation because it supersedes it. Fairly obviously, if this didn't happen, we'd be stuck with every law ever made in perpetuity and a legal system of law contradicting law upon law. The Internal Market Bill is made to update old law in light of recent developments, and that development is the refusal of the European Union to compromise on certain demands in the spirit of good faith. Right, so that's not a good examination of the rule of law. In part 2, we'll start by giving it a better shot than the good bishops, and then demonstrating how this case is but a veneer for the deeper conflict going on, which is between English and Roman law, between the law of nation-state democracies and the law of supranational globalists, and thus between two very different fundamental ways of organising society and the world. Thank you.